So as Jussara mentioned, I actually have a medical degree, but it's probably was not meant for me to be a medical doctor or to work as one, because after medical school, I moved directly to Germany to do a master's and a PhD in neuroscience. That was in Göttingen. And I fell in love with the brain and studying the brain and understanding it. But over the time, I realized that the part of the job I enjoy most is actually writing the code to analyze the data. So in 2022, I moved here to London, to UCL, and I now work as a research software engineer, which is a complicated title, but essentially what it means that I write code and make software tools to help researchers, in this case, researchers that study the brain. So in my current role, I'm part of a team. We call ourselves the Neuroinformatics Unit, and you see a photo of all of us here. According to our own mission statement, which we invented, we are dedicated to the development of high quality, accurate, robust, easy to use and maintainable open source software for neuroscience and machine learning. And there's quite a lot of people here and we work on different topics. The story behind it is that we are situated at the Sainsbury Wellcome Centre for Neural Circuits and Behavior, which is an institute that studies the brain, both experimentally and also theoretically. So we build tools that benefit this institute, but also the wider community that studies the brain. And these tools can be about neuroanatomy, data management, electrophysiology, different techniques, but part of it is about animal behavior. And in fact, 3 of the members of the team, including Nick, myself, Sophia, who is, I think, here at the webinar, and Chang Kwan, we are primarily focusing on animal behavior. So you might be asking yourselves, why do neuroscientists care about behavior? And I think this is nicely answered by 2 quotes that I've put here. If we are to understand how the brain works, we need to think about the actual problems it evolved to solve. So addressing this challenge means studying natural behavior. And secondly, detailed examination of brain parts or the selective perturbation is not sufficient to understand how the brain generates behavior. This is to say that in the last decade or so, neuroscientists have realized that the brain or neural systems in general exist to generate behavior, to generate movement, to make animals act in the world. So if we want to understand it, it's not enough just to look at the computations that the brain does. We also have to look at how they manifest in the world. So looking at behavior. And I would say there are 2 different traditions coming from different fields about studying animal behavior. And one tradition comes from the neuroscience itself and from experimental psychology. And this tradition usually involves animals who are highly trained and restrained, and the animals are trained with rewards or punishments to do very specific tasks, which are very well defined, like rats pressing a lever or monkeys pressing on a screen. And we look at their brain activity while they are doing this very specific, very constrained task. And we measure the task and the activity very precisely. There is a competing tradition coming from the field of ethology or behavioral ecology, where people go to in the field, in the wild, to meet the animals where the animals are. And they use different methods. A very common method is the so-called ethogram, which is basically a list of behaviors that a given species can do. And here I've put an example created by a colleague of mine here at the Sainsbury Wellcome Centre, Sana. And she's creating an ethogram about the fiddler crab, which is apparently a crab that frequents the beaches in Portugal. And she started creating this list of basically what are the behaviors we can describe and how is each behavior, like foraging and burrowing, defined. Then when she goes to the beaches in Portugal or when she films there, she looks at the videos and at given time intervals, she records what each individual was doing, which one of these behaviors was the individual engaging in. So this is kind of the classical approach, the ethogram approach. But if we think about it, these 2 approaches prioritize different things. In psychology or neuroscience, we've prioritized studying very simple behaviors very precisely, while in ethology, people have looked at not so precise measurements of naturalistic behaviors. These 2 kind of traditions are today converging because people are moving to precisely measuring natural behaviors. And sort of a new field is emerging, and that field has many names. Some call it computational ethology or sometimes computational neuroethology. And it evolves precisely capturing and measuring behavior, and they're measuring it as movements, because a definition of behavior that's from Tinberger's 1951 book, The Study of Instinct, says that behavior is the total movements made by the intact animal. And I mean movement here in the broadest sense, because, for example, vocalizations, language is also movement because it involves the movement of my muscles in the larynx and the face. So how do we capture movements? There are several approaches. The most popular probably is videography, so taking videos of the behavior. But we could also record the sound with microphones to capture the vocalizations. We could use GPS trackers to follow up how animals and humans move across long distances, or specialized sensors that can measure, let's say, the velocity or acceleration at given joints. These are similar to the sensors we have in our phones and detect when the phone is dropped, for example. So today I will mostly talk about videography because that's probably the most widely used technique, and also it's the one I know the most about. Traditionally, when we have videos, how do we extract the movement from the video? We have done so in the past using marker-based techniques. This means that we put either colored markers on the animals, or we put something reflective or something that's shining on the animal or human. You see some examples here in the images. Because these colors or lights make it easier for us later when we go to the computer to analyze the data, because we can set some thresholds and find where the colored markers are in the image, or find the lights and follow how these lights or colors move over time. So this is kind of a summary of the marker-based techniques, but these have some challenges. Well, first of all, they are invasive, as you can see, because they involve you doing something to the animal or the human. You have to place these markers. You also have to decide a priori what markers to use and where to place them. So this kind of limits your analysis later. And they can be expensive. So you need specialized equipment that you might not be able to afford, or you have to do the experiment in specialized spaces. The more flexible approach, which has emerged recently, is the so-called markerless approach, where you use artificial intelligence or machine learning to automatically discover these markers on the animals without you having to place any marker on them physically. So in the next slides, I will try to explain, to give some intuition behind how these methods work. And I will, but a useful framework to think about these methods is that what they essentially do is they kind of transform the data from images, which is the input, to positions of body parts, which is the output. And this is sort of the technical term for it would be dimensionality reduction, because we start with an image with many, many pixels, sometimes thousands, sometimes millions, and we end up with a few points that we care about, and we track these points over time, and we represent movement as the movement of these points. A little bit of intuition about machine learning. Notice that I use the term machine learning instead of artificial intelligence. I prefer it, and I think it's more descriptive to what the method actually does. And I will explain why. So in traditional programming or traditional computer science, what we do as programmers is that we take data and we use our expertise to write a program, and the program gives precise instructions to the computer on how to manipulate this data to arrive at our desired result or output. Machine learning kind of flips this paradigm on its head, because instead of taking the data and the program, we take the data and known labels of the data. And now we try to teach the computer in a process called training to infer the function or the transformation that's necessary to go from the data to the labels. So over time, the computer learns a sort of a program that it needs to write to take you from the data to the labels. And this program is often encoded in the form of a neural network, and it's encoded in something called the network weights. Once we have a trained network, we take that network and we apply it to some new data, which the network has not yet seen, in a process called inference, to get some predictions, so get some labels for that new data. So now, if we take this general framework, how do we apply it to the actual images or videos we care about? So let's say, images of animals. It basically comes down to choosing the right data and the right labels. So the right data in this case is either images or videos of animals. And in terms of labels, we have a few different choices depending on what exactly we are trying to do. A very simple case would be some semantic labels. For example, we can annotate the images saying that this is a mouse or this is not a mouse, or this is a cat and this is a dog. And then the algorithm will learn to transform the images into the label. So given an image of a mouse, it will tell you if it's a mouse or not. That's kind of the simplest case. And it falls under the category of classification. Another approach to classification is to think about not the whole image, but each pixel specifically. And basically, you can classify each pixel as either belonging to the mouse or not belonging to the mouse. The output of this program will be a sort of a mask, a pixel mask that marks where the mouse is. And that technique is called segmentation. Another family of techniques takes a different approach. One very commonly used in the field is detection. This basically involves drawing a bounding box around the animals you want to find. You draw many of them, you teach the computer how to find them, and then the computer, basically given new data, finds bounding boxes around the animals, which allows you to actually detect the animals in the image. Instead of bounding boxes, we can also detect points, either a single point, let's say in the center of the animal, or more often, multiple points placed at different body parts of the animal. And this last technique is probably the most popular one nowadays, and it's called pose estimation, because you're using these points, these multiple points, to estimate the posture or the pose of the animal in the image. So not only tells you where the animal is, but also which way it's oriented, and tells you something about its the position of its limbs and so on. Of course, we are not limited to only using one of these labels. We can also combine different techniques. For example, if you combine the bounding box detection with the semantic labels, then we will not only get the boxes, so find the animals where they are, but also each box will have a label telling us, for example, which animal it is. We can also combine the pose estimation with the labels to arrive at a similar result. Now, so far I've talked about images, but now I want to move on to videos. So let's imagine we record the continuous video of an animal, and a video can be thought of as a continuous sequence, an ordered sequence of images. So the techniques I described have a natural extension to videos, because what we can do is we can analyze first each frame separately. So we can take each video frame, find the centroid or the bounding box or multiple points, depending on what we are interested in. And then we go frame by frame and we sort of connect the dots and connect each frame to the next frame. And this way we are able to create a trajectory of the animal across time. This is simple to do when you have only one animal, because you can just connect the dots for as long as the animal is there. But it gets quite complicated when you have more than one animal, because if you have 2 or 3 or more animals, it's usually a challenge to ensure that the identity of the animal is maintained across time and you're not mixing, let's say, animal A with animal B. I will not go into these details, but there are solutions to this, and there are approaches that can do it reasonably well, but it's a difficult problem computationally. Also, I will mention briefly that so far I've been talking about 2D data, but you could also apply these techniques in 3D. So to know the actual location in 3D space of the animal and its limbs. For that, you need a bit more advanced equipment. You would use typically multiple cameras looking at the animal from multiple angles, and you would need to know the relative position of each camera to every other camera. And if you have that information, what you can do is train one neural network per camera to detect the points, which are 2D, and then use some triangulation to basically combine this 2D data and reconstruct a 3D pose. If you're interested, I've left some references there at the bottom for you to look at with further readings on this topic. Luckily, we don't need to go into too much detail about how each of these techniques work, because there already are existing software tools which are also easy to use, and they are very heavily used in research that allow you to do all the things I just described. So there are tools like DeepLab Cat, that's probably the most famous one, but also Sleep, ID Tracker, etc., which allow you to take videos, train neural network models, and then allow you to do stuff like the things I'm showing on the right-hand side, basically track points across animals across time. So because of the availability and explosive popularity of these tools in the last decade or so, we've seen an increasing adoption by many fields. So one field is my field, neuroscience. But of course, we are not the only ones interested in animals and how they move, as this webinar demonstrates. Ethologists are also, of course, very interested in that, behavioral ecologists, but also veterinary doctors or people that work in animal welfare or people that work in livestock farming. All of these fields care about, for one reason or the other, about how animals move. So they want to find the animals in images or in videos, and they want to track their motion over time. The good news is that because of these machine learning techniques, all of these fields have now started converging on similar methods for tracking the animals. So many of these fields are using either bounding box detection or pose estimation to find the animals and track them over time. However, it's not so clear what happens after that. Let's say we manage to locate the body parts and track them across time. What do we do with the data? Because normally, as researchers, we are not interested in the actual position of the animal's, let's say, shoulder or nose. What we want to know is, for example, is this animal anxious? How is it sick? Is it interacting with other animals? Which areas of the environment is it exploring? How fast is it moving? These are kind of the questions maybe as a researcher you want to ask, depending on your field of interest. And these tools, although they allow you to track the animals, they don't help you answer those questions. So I think this field as a whole has a series of growing pains because it's a new field. And I've summarized some of them here. One major pain point is that there's a lack of any sort of standardized data format or processing pipeline, meaning that each tool that I showed you and each field uses a completely different file format to store this data and different approaches of how to process it. We also don't talk enough to each other, so there's not much crosstalk between the fields. This means that we are duplicating a lot of effort. And also a lot of researchers from some of these fields lack software development skills, so it's not so easy for them to use this software and to analyze the data. We end up in a situation where we have a lot of fragile in-house tools. So each lab develops its own custom solution for extracting the metrics they care about from the data. And this solution usually stops working after the PhD student leaves the lab. And these machine learning methods are great, but they also create a problem. The problem is that we are getting way more data than we can analyze. So we are now throwing these techniques onto videos. We get a bunch of tracking data, but then the bottleneck is we don't actually know what to do with it, or we don't have easy ways to deal with this data. So I think this is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity because since there's this convergence across fields on the same methods, we can fill this gap by creating sustainable and easy to use open source tools. And this is where kind of our team comes into the game. Because when I joined the team, we talked to several labs here, and all of them told us about these problems. So we started imagining what would be the ideal tool to allow us to process a bunch of motion tracking data from animals. And we came up with a set of criteria that our ideal tool would have to fulfill. Our ideal tool must be able to read from a variety of tracking formats. So it shouldn't matter if you used DeepLab Cat, Sleep, or something else to track the animal. You should be able to analyze data regardless. It should be agnostic to the animal species because all of the fields I presented study different animals. So we shouldn't make any assumptions that, for example, our animal is always a mouse. It should support multiple general purpose analysis workflows because research questions vary and they changed from day to day and from field to field. So we want to create a toolbox that gives you a lot of general tools that then you can recombine and reconfigure in any way that you see as suitable for your analysis. And we also want the tool to cater to people with a variety of backgrounds and resources. We don't want this to be only useful to people with access to data centers or high performance computing clusters. We want the average research assistant or PhD student with a laptop to be able to analyze the data. And more importantly, we want this to be not fragile, but we want to maintain this over a long term, ideally collaboratively, to reduce the maintenance burden. Our answer to all of these challenges is the package we call Movement. And this is kind of a work in progress. We started working on it 2 years ago, and we will keep working on it for many years. But we are sort of building it one step at a time. And the vision for the package is to be able to read outputs from all these different machine learning frameworks that I presented, whether it's bounding boxes or points or segmentation masks, import all those data into a single standardized format. Because once it's in the same format, we can start developing methods to analyze all of this data. And these methods may include approaches for cleaning the data, deriving some kinematic metrics from it, visualizing the data, and so on. So I will go briefly in the next slides over the strengths of this package. As I mentioned, this package is able to read from a variety of formats. And no matter where the data came from, it's represented currently as either a set of points, which are the poses, or a set of boxes, bounding boxes. And we essentially had to think about what are the variables that we need to keep track of. Because no matter how the data was acquired, it always takes a certain form, because we're always talking about positions in space across time that belong to one or more animals. So we designed this data format in a way to accommodate all this data so that you as a researcher later can very easily select subsets of the data. So for example, you can say, I want to see the data only for animal A, only between the 30th and the 60th second, and only for the right shoulder, for example. And this is very easy to do with Movement. Once the data is in this format, we provide a lot of quick summary plots so that you can inspect the data in a fast way. For example, on the left, you see here the trajectory of the animal in this maze. It's a mouse navigating a plus-shaped maze, and you can see where the animal was between the 60th and the 90th second in this case. And on the right-hand side, you see what's called an occupancy heat map. So this is a heat map of the positions of the mouse over the experiment. For example, pixels that are hot are basically the locations where the animal was frequently, and pixels that are cold or dark blue are positions where the mouse was less frequently. And we are building many plots of this sort to allow you to actually look at the data and get a quick impression of what your data tells. Another big part of Movement is cleaning the data. And this is quite necessary because these machine learning approaches make a lot of mistakes. Here on the left, you see kind of confidence histograms for different body parts. These models often also tell you not only where the body part is or where the animal is, but also how confident the model is about this prediction. And if you look at the confidence that this model itself reports, we see that it's not equally confident across all body parts, and sometimes it's not confident at all. And this is no surprise because sometimes in some video frames, detection is very hard because maybe a body part disappears behind an obstacle or behind another animal, or maybe something moves very fast. So it's very hard to consistently detect a body part in every frame. And we can see that in this paper. You can see, for example, that the red dot, which is the tail of the mouse here, is detected correctly in the first frame, but in the next frame, it's detected incorrectly. And if you actually track the positions of the body parts across time, you see that they are jittery. That's because, as I explained earlier, these models work frame by frame. So they first detect the animal in each frame, and then they connect the dots. So if there is a slight noise in each detection, when you connect the dots, you get this jittery timeline. So in Movement, we provide a lot of methods to deal with the situation. So we provide methods for you to reject data with low confidence values, to interpolate over small gaps in the data, or to smooth the data to remove the jitter, etc. Another set of techniques that we implement in Movement has to do with quantifying motion. And this has to do with what I mentioned earlier about us not being interested in the positions of these body parts per se, but in actual metrics derived from these body parts. For example, you probably care more about things like the speed of the animal, where it is in the maze, how it's oriented in space, what is its head direction, things like that. And in Movement, we actually built functions that allow you to compute all these variables based on this tracking data. For example, here you see in these plots the heading, so the orientation of the animal over time, and the length of that arrow scales with the speed of the animal. And this is all calculated by movement. And as I mentioned, we have different techniques, different metrics, and we are constantly adding more and more. For example, now you can also compute distances between different body parts, or you can compute the length of a trajectory that the animal has traveled in a given window of time, etc. So all of this so far has been very general, but we eventually envision this tool to be used in many different applications. And I just showcased one application here, which is pupillometry or pupil tracking. So many neuroscientists are interested in tracking the position of the pupil over time and the size of the pupil. For example, here you see the pupil of a mouse in two different conditions. On the left, we are in a dark room. That's what the black there means. And the pupil is slightly larger. And on the right, we are in a kind of uniformly lit room, and the pupil is smaller. And you can actually use movement to represent the diameter of the pupil over time in both conditions. And you can see both the difference in the diameter between the two conditions, but also how this diameter varies over time. You could also plot the velocity of the pupil over time. And you can see in this example that the spikes indicate points in the video where the pupil rapidly moves to the right or to the left. And it's very easy to detect in these plots. But this is just an example, and many more applications are underway. So we are thinking about providing options for people to analyze interactions between the animal and its environment. For example, where the animal is in relationship to some regions of interest that the experimenter determines, how it's oriented in relation to those regions of interest. We also want to look at how different animals interact with each other. So metrics of interaction between animals, analysis of gait, which is important for many fields, or collective behavior. This is stuff like flocking behavior. So we are constantly looking for collaborators who work in these fields to help us develop the functions to add to movement to support these applications. You might be wondering, how do I use this package? Because I'm only showing you the results. So currently, movement is only usable as a Python program, essentially. You have to be able to program in Python to use movement. It's not so difficult as if you have experience with Python. This is an example script. If you do not, don't be scared about it. Basically, you write scripts and you tell movement what you want to do. For example, here you can say filter by confidence, or select a specific time point, a specific individual, or plot the position of all key points across time, things like that. However, I mentioned earlier that we want to cater to users across different expertises and backgrounds. So we are really keen to also create a graphical user interface so people who cannot code can also use the package. And we are working on this currently, and we are creating a user interface so that you can do all the analysis I talked about by essentially clicking buttons and looking at the data in a nice window. This is in development. Hopefully, a first version of that will be released soon. But just letting you know that we are aware of this, and we are working towards essentially enabling people without programming knowledge to also analyze the data. An important factor that I want to highlight here is the way we approach software development. This is true across all of our tools. We do software development openly on GitHub, so everything we do is public from the get-go. The discussions we have about it, the debates we have, the meetings we have, the meeting notes, every piece of code from the very moment it's written, it's open and public for everyone to see, criticize, inspect, contribute, etc. And as you see here, already 17 people, or actually 15 people and 2 bots, have already contributed code to movement. So it's not just me writing it on my desk. And this is really important for the sustainability of this package over long term, because it's not dependent on me leaving for a different job tomorrow, or Sophia leaving, or Adam leaving. It's actually a community effort. We take into account what the community wants, and we involve everyone in its development and its maintenance to ensure that the package will exist and will keep up to date over time, because software that's not maintained basically ceases to exist after a few months or a year. So this is a good opportunity for me to prompt you to check out our website. And as I mentioned, we welcome contributions from everyone working in the field. So a contribution just can be an idea for a feature, or maybe you identify the problem with the software that you want to report to us. We have communication channels on our website for you to get in touch with us. And I will also mention that if you are not a Python user, but prefer using the programming language R, there is another project called AnyMovement, which is kind of our sister project for R users, developed by a different team. But I encourage you to check out the project because we implement very similar things and we are constantly in touch to make sure that both packages do kind of similar things. So after giving you all this advertisement about the package, I will want to emphasize what does Movement not do to not be misleading. First of all, Movement does not do motion tracking itself. As I mentioned, this is done by other tools based on artificial intelligence, which already exists, so we don't want to reinvent the wheel. Movement sits downstream of those tools. Another thing that Movement does not do, it does not do a task called action segmentation. This is something I haven't mentioned so far in the interest of time, but I will briefly touch on now. So we looked at representing movement as trajectories of points over time, but often we think of behaviors as distinct things. For example, sniffing or playing or singing or talking. These are distinct behaviors with distinct onset and end. So there is a task in machine learning which has to do with taking these continuous measures of behavior, the continuous tracks, and transforming them into distinct actions. And this task is called action segmentation. And there are machine learning tools out there that can perform this task with various levels of success. And I've linked to papers that are on this topic down below, so you can check if you're interested. But Movement does not do that. And the reason is that we want to keep Movement quite simple. And so far, we've avoided actually using artificial intelligence within Movement. Although the tools that come upstream and downstream of Movement use artificial intelligence, we want to keep Movement as a simple program that can run on any computer without need for expensive GPUs, etc. So Movement is, in a way, a traditional computer science program. That said, we are thinking about also creating other tools that maybe cover these other areas. And of course, these tools will be interoperable with Movement so that you can use them in conjunction. I will try to end with a kind of call to action here. So as I said earlier, there is this convergence in methodologies across many different fields. And I identified this convergence as an opportunity for us to fill it with open source tools. And I presented the Movement, but there are other efforts in the community that are also great and follow good development practices that try to address this problem. But it's not enough to develop the tools. You also have to educate people on how to use them. So another part of our mission is to educate, especially early career researchers, and to empower them to not only use these tools, but also learn how to contribute to them. Because I think it's very empowering if you're able to modify, to see, not only look inside the tools you're using, but also modify them to fit your purpose. And this is a mission that the Software Sustainability Institute agrees with or is on board with. And they've awarded me a fellowship to pursue this further. And actually, that's how I met Melissa, the next speaker, and that's how I got introduced to Veronica in the first place. And thanks to the support of the Software Sustainability Institute, we are planning on organizing an event in August in London. We call it the Open Software Week, and it will involve many different workshops. But relevant to this audience, it will involve a day of introduction into Python programming, a 2-day workshop about all the things I talked about today. So how to track animals in videos, how to use Movement to analyze the data, etc. Call this the Animals in Motion workshop. And we will end with a hackathon where we will sit together with the participants and try to code together with them and help them maybe contribute to some of these existing open source tools to kind of move towards that empowerment I talked about earlier. This is not yet officially announced, but you can save the date and more details will come soon on our website. I want to thank you for your attention. Thanks again to the organizers for inviting me, and thanks also to the funders that pay for the team and for my time. This is Wellcome Trust, the Gatsby Foundation, and the Sainsbury Wellcome Centre, where we are located. And yeah, I'm quite fortunate that I'm being paid a salary to create tools that are free for everyone, and I quite like this job. I've also put links to my social media on GitHub and on Mastodon, where you can get in touch if you have something to discuss relevant to the things we talked about. And I think because I'm a bit early on time, Veronica, you can confirm, or Jussara, but I'm also happy to take a few questions about the talk either now or later during the panel discussion.